Hi, my name's Dr. George Starling. I work at SOAS, part of the University of London, and this is research that is also based on the PhD thesis which I completed at the University of Edinburgh with Mitsota. So what I'm going to talk to you today about is distributional learning and the vowel system of American English. And I'd like to present this as a real genuine learnability problem within early phonological development. So really what I want to demonstrate through a series of learning models is that it is not possible to recover accurate phonetic categories from the linguistic input by using statistics alone. Really, this mechanism needs to be supplemented with something further. So perceptual attunement refers to the emergence of language-specific perceptual behaviors within the first year of life. So the way that we as adults perceive language is fundamentally different from those adults who speak other languages. Newborns, by contrast, discriminate all possible distinctions. So Janet Worker and Richard Tees in the 80s demonstrated that 6-month-olds could discriminate a distinction between two adjectives, between dental and retroflex stops, and also between a native distinction between ba and da. And really, perceptual attunement has been described as featuring two main changes in infant sensitivity. So that is the maintenance of native categories and the loss of all others. So by the age of 1 year, infants who are exposed to English have lost their sensitivity to these adjectives, to these subcoronal distinctions that are present in languages like Hindi. And a really important paper in this domain further demonstrates that for vowels, perception is native-like by the age of around 6 to 8 months. So Suji has done a really nice meta-analysis of the discrimination tasks that have been run, reviewing the methods that have been used and reviewing the results and determining the general age in which we can claim this emergence of native-like language-specific behaviors. And the main mechanism that is invoked by theories of perceptual learning is one that uses statistical learning. So Jessica May and colleagues demonstrated in 2002 that infants are capable of tracking the statistical regularities of the input, and that exposure to specific kinds of distributional information has an effect on infant perception at 6 to 8 months. So infants who are exposed to a bimodal distribution, having two sets of high-frequency tokens, so one that is D-like and the other that is T-like, continue to discriminate what is a native distinction for them. And so if you are exposed to input which features these two clusters of acoustic values, then perception continues. The discrimination that we saw at birth continues to prevail. However, if infants are exposed to a unimodal distribution, so just a central mass of ambiguous points between the voiced and the voiceless consonant, what we see is that discrimination attenuates. So what we predict is that infants who are exposed to input that lacks a distinction should fail to discriminate a voicing distinction later in development because they haven't received the relevant input or because they've received input that suggests the absence of a contrast. Now, theories of perceptual learning, so things like Premier and the native language magnet theory, attribute a central role to linguistic experience. And really, linguistic experience is stated to really be this question of what the statistics of the input are. These are the factors that drive perceptual attunement. And really, there's a major question of how the frequency of acoustic tokens in the input shape learners' perception within early development. So there is a question of, there is very little that can be specified as innate within this task because so much of it is about the specific number of categories that a language has. and also exactly how those categories are implemented. And so there's a major question of ecological validity here. If we can see certain effects in laboratory contexts, how can we claim that those same effects may occur when infants are exposed to naturalistic input? And so really, if you want to ask any poverty of the stimulus arguments, I think a really good case within phonology is looking at the acoustic inputs, looking at the statistics of it, and considering whether they support the kinds of learning mechanisms that we've seen evidenced in laboratory contexts. So typically, this process of perceptual attunement and the statistical learning mechanisms that are involved in it have been empirically supported by a series of computational models. So in general, these models are going to identify categories by locating three variables at the same time. So K, a number of clusters within a system, the number of distinctive vowel sounds here, if we're considering acoustic space, the central tendency, so their position relative to one another in space, and finally variance, so kind of the amount of spread, the limits of each category, where one ends and the next begins. And if you look at this unlabeled data that we have on the right-hand side of the page here, you know, it should be intuitive to you that there are three groups here. In fact, there are three groups. These are Feldman distributions of F1 and F2 for E, A, and R, from a sample of a speaker producing infant-directed speech. And so it seems at this point that it is fairly viable to use distributional learning to identify meaningful categories from a sample of linguistic input. However, American English doesn't just have 3 vowel sounds. Instead, it has 15. And so this is the genuine learnability problem that I want to talk about today. How can infant learners begin to identify categories from something when the structure is not trivially apparent from the regularities that occur in the input? Trying to fit 15 categories, 15 clusters to the data that we see presented here is not a particularly tractable task. And so really what I want to highlight is that many previous models in this domain have overstated the usefulness of distributional learning in infancy, as they've really simplified the task in a way that we don't want to assume that the infants learn. So some models used in this domain specifically learn a known number of clusters. So this value of K, the number of clusters that occur in your native language, is given to these models in advance. Infants can't, of course, come to the learning of American English knowing that there will be exactly 15 vowel sounds. Secondly, there are models that, although they learn the number of clusters, they're exposed to just a subset of the system. So not only is there less to learn, but this also reduces potential cases of overlap between vowels. So if we look back at our tokens of E, A, and R, there are obviously some more confusable alternatives that learners would have to contend with in order to identify these three categories. And finally, there's a set of models that do both of the above. So there are certain cases like De Boer and Kuhl where these models just learn E, U, and R, and they know that there should be 3 categories in this system in advance. And so really, these models provide a limited sort of support for the use of this mechanism. They don't really represent the learning task that infants face in a particularly accurate way. And really, if we strip away these assumptions, even when we use fairly complex learning models, it's not possible to replicate the rapid and accurate learning that we see in infancy for American English vowels using these kind of statistical mechanisms. So Naomi Feldman's work is someone that I'm going to highlight in a moment or two. And generally the results of these models identify too few categories. And so really what we predict from this is that if children are exposed to the acoustics that we see in American English, they should collapse or fail to remain sensitive to distinctions that are relevant in their native language. So if we see the results of an infinite Gaussian mixture model here from Feldman et al. 2013, what we see is that these models recover 12 clusters from the 12 monophthongs that they are exposed to. So there are some distinctions, most notably that between a and e, that are not identified by the model. And one thing to remind that I'm going to highlight here is that these are models that are trained on red speech. So those of you who know James Hillenbrand's work, this is this very low variance and speech in isolation type data. It's not the kind of thing that children are going to hear day to day. And so my major pair of hypotheses that I want to present today are considering the extent to which we can expect this type of statistical learning to be successful if we consider a more ecologically valid dataset that resembles the linguistic input that learners receive. So on the one hand, I want to consider hyperarticulation, so the idea pushed by Patricia Kuhl that, in interactions, caregivers intentionally enhance the distinctions that they are producing to facilitate learning. The second is one by Daniel Swingley. So many of the models in this domain consider just the distribution of the first two formants. There's more to vowel acoustics than that. And so it's possible that some of the cases of overlap and ambiguity that we see in formant distributions may be mitigated in a way that permits learning by including dimensions such as vowel duration, formant dynamics, and the third formant in addition to the first two. So what I did in much of my doctoral work is perform a forced alignment and automated acoustic analysis of 4 caregivers' speech interacting both with children and with an adult interviewer. This was a reanalysis of data that was originally gathered in the 80s by Nanben Steen-Ratner, and from a series of 3 lots of 30-minute unstructured sessions for both adult-directed speech and infant-directed speech, I was able to gain a total of 13,000 tokens using the FAVE suite, which is common in sociophonetics, but I found it equally valid for use with caregiver data. So what I considered in my modeling work was a set of 15 vowels of American English, so 12 monophthongs, 3 diphthongs, 6 acoustic dimensions, as I've mentioned briefly, so both the first 2 formants at the midpoint of each vowel, and also the change in each of those as through the vowel's duration, a static measure of the third formant, and also a measure of vowel duration. And I used both k-means clustering and multinomial logistic regressions in order to explore the statistical regularities within these large datasets. Both of these models were implemented in R. So k-means clustering really is our unsupervised approach. It doesn't know the value of k, the number of categories in advance. It can locate anywhere between 1 cluster and 20 clusters using a similarity-based approach. This is what I intend as being the most akin to the use of distributional learning in a naturalistic context. And I assessed this by considering both the number of categories that it recovered and also an accuracy measure known as the pairwise F-score. I also applied multinomial logistic regressions to the data. So these are trained on labeled acoustic variables, labeled acoustic tokens, and tested on an additional unlabeled data set. And really, rather than being a proxy for infant learning, this is a heavily supervised, really ideal observer approach to this statistical learning. If you know everything about the data set, what can these statistical properties of the input actually allow you to learn about the category structure of American English? And again, there's an accuracy statistic associated with these models, and we'll look briefly as well at the regression coefficients that came out of these models. So this is what the input data for the clustering models, the k-means models looked like. So we see on the left here is adult-directed speech, and then with greater overlap on the right is infant-directed speech. So we see the 15 vowels that were considered, cases of overlap between them. This is just one of the 4 speakers, and this is an aggregate across all the sessions that she produced data in. Now, what do these models produce given these cases of overlap? Well, what we see is they collapse distinctions, and rather than returning 15 categories, often they return between 6 and 8 clusters, regardless of the register that they're applied to. So if we look at the statistics for models that were applied to all of the acoustic dimensions that I considered, and those that were just applied to formant models, what we see is that the addition of these further acoustic dimensions does result in an increase, a significant increase in both the number of categories that are found, and also an increase in the F-score, which is this accuracy statistic. Across registers, what we see is a mix of results. So for the most part, we see improved performance in adult-directed speech compared to infant-directed speech. And there's further results that I'm very, very happy to discuss with you about the status of hyperarticulation and why there appears to be hypoarticulation, so a deterioration of contrasts in infant-directed speech. And what we see is that in either case, even when you are exposed to data from a register with a lesser degree of overlap that has all of these additional acoustic dimensions, we don't replicate the accurate learning of categories that we would expect through the use of this mechanism. So yeah, what I've said here, generally they recovered 6 to 8 clusters. Adult-directed speech generally outperformed infant-directed speech, and this aligned with a comparative acoustic analysis that I'm happy to discuss in full, but really it's beyond the scope of this learnability talk. And also, multi-dimensional acoustic data did help to the accuracy of these models, but if anything, these models actually exhibited poorer performance than those models that I talked through before, the Feldman paper, that were applied to just samples of read speech. With the logistic regressions, even though these were a supervised technique where they received labeled data, classification accuracy is not at ceiling. There were errors in categorization here, indicating that there was poor learning from ambiguous data. Again, what we see if we compare the infant-directed results with the adult-directed results is that ADS outperforms IDS for 3 of the 4 speakers. This again indicates this case of hypoarticulation that I wanted to discuss in IDS. What we can also examine is the regression coefficients. So for each model and for each acoustic dimension, there were 14 potential categories that it could have identified instead of the reference level. So if it was the case that all 14 of these categories depended on the acoustic variables that are listed here, so from left to right we've got the third formant, the 2 dynamic formant measures, and then finally duration, what we see is that quite often in these models there were significant regression coefficients for each of these dimensions across a wide number of categories. So this does support Zwingli's point that multi-dimensional data does support statistical approaches to learning in infancy. So what I really want to argue is that distributional learning alone isn't going to be sufficient. There is a genuine kind of poverty of the stimulus where the linguistic input doesn't present these statistical regularities that would be required for distributional learning to be successful. Computational models, really there's a theoretical, a methodological point that I want to make about whether these are successful or not. Really, the assumptions behind them really matter, and we want to closely model infant learning if we want to make relevant comments about the viability of specific mechanisms And if anything, these models predict that learners should have a reduced sensitivity to native distinctions, rather than a pattern of maintenance. So, further to this, it's not the case that infant-directed speech facilitates the use of statistical learning in infancy, contra what is argued in Kuhl et al. It's really quite common in the literature now to observe cases of hypo-articulation in infant-directed speech relative to adult-directed speech. What I did find support for in using these models was this idea that multi-dimensional acoustic data does facilitate statistical learning. However, I would say don't misinterpret this finding as evidence that if you use enough acoustic dimensions, the task becomes trivial and relevant native language categories just pop out of the data. And finally, as I've said, a main point that I want to make here is that really vowel categorization in infancy, one of the earliest processes that learners go through, is a genuine learnability problem. Theory's view, what I will say is that, it is not the case that statistical learning is the only part of the signal, the only mechanism that learners can use. Really, attunement is this holistic process, and it's not just the case that learners are tracking only the acoustic signal that they hear. And really, models that are taking this kind of view of incorporating phonotactics or word learning seem to be promising, and the idea that we can have bootstrapping across different levels of linguistic structure is an extremely useful one, and one that model work is building towards in the current literature. So I'd like to say thank you to Charles and the rest of you at Concordia here for continuing to host this event, and I will gladly take any questions via email or throughout the day on between the 6th and the 8th. All right, perfect. Bye.